Chapter 8 is on Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel narrative. And I spend a whole chapter on this because I think it's a really key chapter for understanding how human culture becomes organized around what the Babel narrative calls making a name for ourselves, which is, of course, really charged language, because one chapter later, God is going to say to Abraham, I'm going to make your name great. So you get this sort of choice. Who makes our name? Do we make a name for ourselves, or does God make great the name of those who trust him? And it's also really key, I think, in the two cities storyline that Augustine is obviously very keen on in the City of God, and that I try and trace through the biblical storyline as well. And what I try and do with the Babel narrative is tease out this idea of what does it mean to make a name for ourselves? How does that work in the modern world? I talk a little bit about social media, leaning on other scholars who are much more sort of up to speed with that sort of thing than I am. And I also talk about Babel as a spectacle. A French philosopher called Guy Debord, who was a situationist in the mid-20th century, wrote a book called The Society of the Spectacle. And he thinks that this idea of spectacle is fundamental to the way that we engage with the world now. And it's all about sort of show and surface impression, and there not necessarily being anything behind that. And I try and read Babel as a spectacle, which is something that's sort of projecting an image to the outside world. Look at how great we are. Everybody around will be able to see this wonderful tower, and we'll say how great our name is. And I do that mainly because I'm going to set up the cross much later on in the book as a counter spectacle. And I think there's an incredibly powerful contrast to be made with the lifting high of Babel on the one hand, and Christ lifted high on the cross in the other hand. And I think the idea of cross as counter spectacle is a really key, potent tool of cultural critique. So I've got an eye to that in setting up Babel as spectacle, but I think it also helps us to find a biblical vocabulary in which to talk about a lot of things that are going on in society at the moment, where there's a great deal of self-presentation, self-curating, making an image of oneself that's in our more honest moments we'd be willing to say is not the true image of us, but we're projecting it onto the world. And of course, social media is part of this, but I don't think it's just a social media phenomenon. The idea of making ourselves into a spectacle, I think, runs really deep in modern society, and that Babel allows us to get a biblical perspective on that as well.